Okay, so you guys have sent in some really interesting stuff this time around. It's kind of got us thinking about like why we're so quick to help when a natural disaster hits, but maybe not as much when it comes to war, especially, with those tragic situations with child soldiers.
Right, right.
Today, we really want to dive deep and figure out the reasons for this difference. Your
Mm.
sources bring up some really interesting psychological and sociological stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
We'll be looking at how we perceive the danger, how
Hmm.
we determine who's responsible. Then there's how our emotions get tied up in it,
Yeah.
like how easily we can empathize or not. We'll also dig into like the practical challenges of actually helping out in these situations, the moral dilemmas, the psychology behind it all.
Yeah, definitely. And then we'll also see how the media kind of shapes our whole view of things.
Right. So let's get this deep dive going.
Let's do it. It's going to be fascinating to see how everything connects, especially, going from those psychological and sociological aspects to the actual reasons behind why we act so differently.
Okay, so let's start with how we see these events. Like when there's a hurricane or an earthquake, it's like, well, it just seems pretty straightforward, right?
Oh, yeah.
Something powerful from outside causes destruction, and the people who get hit are obviously victims.
Exactly. Like our brains are wired to look for cause and effect. In these natural disasters, the cause is kind of impersonal. It's the earth moving or a storm just going crazy. But that immediately makes us all feel a little vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it could happen to anyone, anywhere. And because there's no person to blame, we see those affected as completely innocent. So naturally, we want to help.
Now, compare that to war. Even when we're talking about something as awful as child soldiers, it's usually presented as a conflict between groups. It's like this extra layer of complexity that kind of overshadows the individual suffering.
Right. Absolutely. And then there's this fascinating thing, the just world hypothesis. We as humans tend to believe that people kind of get what they deserve.
Yeah, we like to think things are fair.
Now, obviously, none of us actually think a child soldier or someone caught in the crossfire deserves that, not on a conscious level at least.
Right.
But this ingrained bias can kind of creep in and affect how we see victims of war. Because we're presented with sides in a conflict, we start to question, even unconsciously, whether everyone's truly innocent.
It's like we're trying to find someone to blame, even when it doesn't make sense.
Right. It's like we feel those suffering are somehow entangled in a mess their group created, no matter how unfair that is.
Wow, that's a really insightful point, even if it is kind of unsettling. It shows how much we crave order and fairness, even when it doesn't apply.
It really does. And our systems actually reinforce this difference. We have organizations, protocols, even laws set up to help after natural disasters.
Yeah, like FEMA and the Red Cross. Everyone knows who to call.
Exactly. It's seen as the right thing to do, humanitarian action.
Yeah.
But imagine trying to help a child soldier in a war zone on your own. It's dangerous, there's no official way to do it, and it might even be seen as interfering with another country.
Right, you could get in serious trouble. So that brings us to how we react emotionally. You mentioned this identifiable victim effect. Can you explain why seeing someone suffering makes us so much more likely to help?
Sure. So it's like this, we're way more likely to connect emotionally and want to help when we see a specific person struggling than when we hear about a large, faceless group in trouble. And natural disasters often give us these powerful images of individual suffering. Think about those photos after a flood. A child holding a single toy amidst the wreckage.
Yeah, you see their face, their fear, and it hits you hard.
It does. Our brains have these things called mirror neurons that help us actually feel, on some level, what others are feeling. So when we see that relatable suffering in one person, those neurons fire up and our empathy goes way up.
But war, with all its destruction and political stuff, can actually do the opposite. We get this compassion fatigue, like we've just seen too much suffering and we can't feel it all.
That's it exactly. When we're constantly bombarded with images of mass suffering, especially in those seemingly endless conflicts, our ability to feel just gets exhausted. And then there's dehumanization, which is tragically common in war.
Dehumanization, you mean like making the enemy seem less human?
Yeah. It makes it easier to ignore their suffering, even when it's innocent civilians or children forced into fighting.
That's messed up. So on a practical level, it's so much easier and safer to donate to, say, the Red Cross after an earthquake than to even figure out how to help a child soldier.
For sure. Contributing to those organizations feels like you're doing something tangible, something that'll actually make a difference. And there's usually no risk to you personally. Plus, even if it's damaged, the infrastructure to deliver aid is usually getting back up and running.
But a war zone, That's a whole different story. It's chaos, constant violence, no infrastructure, and it's super dangerous just being there.
Right. Forget about trying to help someone. The risks are huge, and the chances of actually helping someone, like a child soldier, in that environment are slim to none. Then there's international law and this idea of national sovereignty, which basically limits individuals from meddling in another country's conflicts.
So you're saying legally there's not much we can do ourselves.
Pretty much.
Okay, now let's talk about the moral and ethical side of things. Helping after a natural disaster, that's just seen as a good thing to do, right?
Yeah, pretty much universally. It's a moral obligation to help those who've lost everything through no fault of their own. But war throws a wrench in things, ethically speaking.
Yeah, things get a lot murkier.
Right. Suddenly, it's not so clear what's right or wrong. Any action could have unintended consequences, even bad ones.
Like you could help one group and end up hurting another.
Exactly. Or you could even prolong the fighting without meaning to.
So what about that principle of non-interference you mentioned earlier? Why does that matter in war?
Well, it basically means countries shouldn't stick their noses in each other's business. It's a big deal in international relations.
Makes sense, but how does that apply to helping people?
Well, see, humanitarian aid after a natural disaster, that's seen as neutral. But getting involved in a conflict, even to save child soldiers, could be seen as taking sides or making things worse. It creates all these ethical dilemmas. And there's also this thing called moral injury.
Moral injury.
It's basically deep psychological distress that comes from doing something or not doing something that goes against your own morals. Imagine being in a war zone and having to make those impossible choices.
I can't even imagine. So how do psychological factors play into all of this? You mentioned the bystander effect being less of a thing after natural disasters. Why is that?
After a disaster, there's this shared sense of urgency and crisis. Everyone sees the devastation, and it creates this feeling of community and vulnerability.
Like we're all in this together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that feeling can actually counteract the bystander effect, where people might hesitate to act if they think others will step up.
So in a disaster, we're more likely to jump in and help.
It seems that way.
But with war, it feels like the sheer size of the problem can make us feel less inclined to act. Like our efforts wouldn't even make a dent.
That's the diffusion of responsibility at play. People think, the problem's so huge, what can I possibly do? And that leads to this feeling of powerlessness, what psychologists call learned helplessness. And that feeling really discourages people from helping.
So it's like we give up before we even start.
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about how the media shapes our views. It feels like natural disasters are always shown as these huge tragedies where people need help immediately, and the focus is on how innocent the victims are.
Oh, absolutely. The media coverage focuses on the human cost. Lives lost, homes destroyed, livelihoods ruined. The victims are portrayed as blameless and vulnerable, which really triggers our empathy and makes us want to help.
It's a very clear message. These people need our help, and it's our duty to give it.
Yeah. But war coverage, even when it shows the suffering of civilians or child soldiers, is way more complicated.
Right, it's not just a simple story of good versus bad.
It's often viewed through a political lens, focusing on the complexities of the conflict, the strategies, and sometimes even demonizing certain groups.
Yeah, you see that a lot, so the message isn't as clear-cut.
Right. While the suffering is reported, it's not always framed in the same way as with natural disasters. It's less about individual vulnerability and blamelessness.
So you're saying the media doesn't always portray those affected by war as purely innocent victims?
Exactly. The narrative might include historical or political contexts that can distance viewers from the human element. And how the media portrays the feasibility of intervention matters too. If war zones are shown as super chaotic and dangerous, it reinforces the idea that helping is impossible, not just difficult.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen why our reactions to these two types of crises are so different. To make it even clearer, let's revisit that scenario we talked about before. An earthquake in a country that's already at war, a place where child soldiers are a known issue. Let's imagine how a 7-year-old girl, a 25-year-old man, a 50-year-old woman, and a 7-year-old man might react to both the earthquake victims and the child soldiers. Let's keep those 6 key factors in mind: perception of threat, emotional response, practicality, morality, psychology, and media framing.
This is a great way to see how these concepts could play out in real life. So let's start with the 7-year-old girl. When she sees other children suffering after the earthquake, she's probably going to feel instant empathy and want to comfort them, maybe even share her toys or something. It's a very pure emotional response to seeing other kids hurt through no fault of their own.
Makes sense. Kids are naturally compassionate.
Right. But when she encounters a child soldier, even one who looks scared and lost, things get more complicated. War is something she probably doesn't fully understand, and the way adults talk about sides and enemies could make it harder for her to see that child soldier as innocent in the same way as the earthquake victims.
Yeah, that's a tough one for a kid to process.
Now, the 25-year-old man, he'll likely feel empathy for the earthquake victims. He sees their humanity, understands that it could have been him.
A random act of nature could happen to anyone.
Exactly. He might donate to a reputable charity, a practical way to help from afar. But the child soldiers, he's probably going to feel overwhelmed and unsure of what to do.
Too complex, too risky.
Yeah. The danger of getting involved in an active conflict, the moral and ethical questions, it all adds up to feeling powerless.
Right. Now, what about the 50-year-old woman?
I think maybe because of her maternal instincts, she'd be deeply affected by the earthquake's impact on families. That would trigger a strong sense of wanting to help, to do something.
You might organize a fundraiser or something.
Exactly, something tangible and beneficial. But with the child soldiers, even though she might feel immense sadness, the danger and complexity and the blurred lines of right and wrong in war would likely lead her to think that direct action is beyond her and maybe even harmful.
So she'd want to help but wouldn't know how.
Right.
And lastly, the 70-year-old man.
He's lived a long life, seen a lot. He might feel a deep sense of shared humanity with the earthquake victims.
Like he understands their suffering on a different level.
Yeah. And that might motivate him to volunteer his time or donate money. But with the child soldiers, while he might feel sorrow and recognize the tragedy of it all, the sheer scale and complexity of war, coupled with the belief that it requires high-level solutions, would likely lead him to think that his individual actions wouldn't matter much.
So he'd kind of feel resigned to the situation.
It's possible. But what's really important here is how those 6 factors we talked about, perception of threat, emotional response, practicality, morality, psychology, and media framing, shape each person's reaction. The earthquake is presented as this clear-cut case of innocent people needing help, framed as a humanitarian crisis. But the child soldiers,
That's a much tougher one.
it is. It's wrapped up in the complexities of war, making it harder to see the victims as purely innocent. Empathy is harder to maintain. Practical help seems impossible. The moral questions are more difficult, and psychological barriers are higher.
Okay, so to wrap this whole deep dive up, the main takeaway is this. How willing we are to help is very different when we're talking about natural disasters versus war, and it comes down to how we perceive the victims and the situation itself. It's about that initial judgment of whether someone is truly a blameless victim, and that judgment then shapes our emotions, our empathy, and everything else.
Exactly. If we don't see them as entirely innocent, all those other factors kick in.
Right. The practical difficulties and dangers of helping in a war zone, the complex moral questions, the psychological barriers we put up, it all contributes to this difference in our response. And of course, the media has a huge influence on how we understand and react to these situations.
It's definitely not a simple issue. There's a lot going on beneath the surface, psychologically, sociologically, and structurally.
Well, this has been a super interesting conversation.
I agree.
And it leaves me with a final thought for you, our listener. Knowing all this about how we perceive victims, our emotional responses, the practical limits, the moral dilemmas, the psychology involved, and the power of the media, how might understanding the complexities of war and the individual suffering within it, no matter what role someone plays, change how willing we are to help and how we go about providing aid in war-torn areas?
That's a big question.
It is. Maybe it starts with recognizing that there are victims on all sides and seeing the humanity in everyone, even those caught in the middle of a conflict.
That's a good start.
And perhaps we need more responsible and empathetic media coverage that helps us see those complexities.
Absolutely.
It's definitely something we all need to think about more deeply. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
This is DigitView.